From the Volcker Alliance and the Penn Institute for Urban Research, this is Special Briefing. I'm Bill Glasgow at the Alliance, and I'm here with my co-host at Penn IUR, Susan Wachter. Hello, Susan.
Hello. And Bill, you are now, for some reason, on mute. So we will welcome back Bill, I'm sure, in just a moment. But in the meantime, Bill and I both welcome our audience to today's special briefing on doom loop or boom loop and work from home and the challenges facing U.S. cities. We have a very special briefing today. Bill, are you back?
I am indeed. And I missed my intro. So from the Volcker Alliance and the Penn Institute for Urban Research, this is Special Briefing. I'm Bill Glasgow at the Alliance, and I'm here with my co-host at Penn IUR, Susan Wachter, who you've already heard from. Hello again, Susan.
Yes,
And in
hello.
this episode of Special Briefing, we are indeed focusing on one of the biggest economic and social issues to arise from the COVID-19 pandemic, which is the rise of remote work and how New York and other cities are coping with the trend as the pandemic has waned. Susan mentioned.
I think that Bill is having technical difficulties, and we'll give Bill another moment, but we can.
We are back on.
Okay, good,
I
Bill.
apologize. I apologize to Susan and the audience. My mic seems to be cutting out today. We'll clean this up later, but we are focusing on a new Volcker Alliance issue paper just out today called Doom Loop or Boom Loop, Work from Home and the Challenges Facing America's Big Cities by Richard Voith, David Stanek, and Yojin Lee of Econsult Solutions in Philadelphia, and our very own Susan Wachter of Penn IUR and the Wharton School. You can download the paper and an exclusive data supplement on the Volcker Alliance website, and our authors will be joined today by three of the sharpest observers of the work from home trend. Stijn Van Nieuwerburgh of the Columbia Business School in New York, Jose Barrero of WFH Research and the ETOM B School in Mexico City, and Kathryn Wylde of the Partnership for New York City. We'll get underway just a moment, but first this word. We're coming to you live on the Volcker Alliance and Penn IUR websites and also on the Special Briefing podcast. We've taken your questions in advance and we'll pose them later in the program. And of course, this special briefing is made possible with the support of the Volcker Alliance, members of the Penn IUR Board of Advisors, and the Century Foundation. And now let's dig into working from home. Susan, as co-host and co-author today, why don't you get us going with your co-authors, Dick and David?
Yes, and this paper and report, which I'm very proud to be part of, is primarily the work of the two people who are speaking today. And we'll start with President and founding principal of Econ Solutions and fellow of Penn IUR and longtime colleague, Dick Voith. And Dick Voith will also be followed by David Stanek, who is Vice President of Econsult Solutions and also Emerging Scholar of Penn IUR. Dick, why don't you take us away?
Thanks very much, Susan. COVID-19 and rapid technological advances like this Zoom meeting have dramatically changed attitudes about working from home and more generally about remote work for both employers and workers. Working from home, especially on a hybrid schedule, has gone from rare to common. At the same time, these shifts have resulted in greater flexibility with respect to working hours and location. And this has led to serious concerns about the impacts on commercial real estate, demand for office space, and the potential fiscal impacts on cities, the roles of public transit systems, and the very viability of cities as we know them. Cities only thrive because they create an environment that is active, innovative, and provides opportunities that are uniquely available only in these dense, active places. These urban agglomerations result in part from in-person interactions that generate higher productivity in firms, higher wages for workers, and greater consumption opportunities for people in general. One way or another, these benefits derived from knowledge sharing, often resulting from in-person discussions and random interactions. It's easy to overlook the role of serendipitous interaction for learning in cities. Work from home potentially undermines these agglomeration benefits and the value of cities. Cities adapt and markets adjust to respond to all sorts of changes, but the challenges from work from home may not be solved by market forces alone. In fact, cities with large agglomerations like New York, market forces may not automatically generate the best outcomes for cities, or for that matter, the nation, because when people find it attractive to work from home, they reduce their in-person interactions with others, potentially lowering the productivity and innovation of those remaining in the in-person workforce. Hence, there's a classic externality for those of us who are economists with work from home. Remote workers save commuting costs and other related costs, but they don't bear the cost of lost productivity in in-person labor for a city. So a city may not reattain its agglomerations. One of our panelists, Stijn Van Nieuwerburgh, has noted the very real possibility of a doom loop scenario of vacant offices, depleted central business districts, declining economic competitiveness, and fiscal stress. And if fiscal stress results in declining crucial services, making working and living in cities less attractive, the doom loop will result in even worse outcomes for cities and for the nation. But is the doom loop the only potential outcome? Over the years, cities like New York have repeatedly adapted to challenges. New York experienced near bankruptcy in the 1970s, but adapted and prospered in the 80s and 90s. After 9/11, many said that dense cities with skyscrapers were too dangerous and again predicted the decline of New York. In late 2007, after the housing market downturn and financial collapse of Lehman Brothers, precipitating the Great Recession, people once again predicted the decline of cities, and New York responded robustly in both instances. Once again, work from home poses a direct and serious challenge to New York City, especially in the commercial office sector and public transportation, but work from home also potentially offers great opportunities for the city. Work from home can potentially lower the cost for firms by shifting some tasks that do not require in-person interaction to be productive to lower cost locations. Firms thereby lower space costs and labor costs, as workers can have flexible, affordable housing at a lower wage. This can allow firms to concentrate employees that typically require in-person interaction to be productive and innovative, effectively resulting in a high concentration of workers that specifically benefit from in-person interaction. This sorting of employees based on their roles that require in-person interaction can enhance agglomeration benefits, wages, profits, all at lower costs. This could make cities like New York even more attractive if it manages to maintain a high quality of life, adapt its transportation systems, and addresses housing affordability. So I'm going to pass it to David Stanek, co-author, who will talk more specifically about the doom loop and boom loop scenarios, how they may play out, and the steps that cities like New York need to take to ensure that the boom loop prevails rather than the doom loop. David, all yours.
Thanks, Dick. I appreciate it. So as part of this report, we looked at overall metrics for 5 different cities. New York was the primary focus for us, but we also looked at Chicago, Miami, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. And I think certainly the pairing of Miami with San Francisco offers the contrast in how cities have been affected by the post-pandemic recovery and what the prospects of future looks like for them. On one hand, we have San Francisco. It's unfortunately the poster child for a difficult post-pandemic recovery. Office vacancy rates hover, depending on which report you're looking at, somewhere between 20 and 30%, projected to rise almost as high as 40% over the next 5 years. Office market values have declined by 16%, and against the national average of about 10%. This is in large part because San Francisco is primarily dependent on the tech sector, but there are some folks out there who have mentioned that generative AI could be the new economic boom for San Francisco. But of course, a lot of the companies that are focused on generative AI are south of San Francisco, and the downtown market is still struggling mightily. Another indicator of San Francisco's struggles is that public transit use within the urban areas is about 55% of pre-pandemic levels. But if you're looking incorporating suburban ridership, it's less than 50%, which is the lowest of the 5 cities that we have. On the other side, we have Miami. So Miami, the office vacancy rates have been steady since 2020 at about between 9 and 10%. Office values have increased on a square footage basis by 23% between 2020 and 2023. Interestingly enough, Miami has lost some percentage in 2020 and 2023, about 4%. But their job growth has been substantial. They lost about 13 jobs during the pandemic and have since gained upwards of 100,000. So Miami and transit recovery has also been up between 80 and 90% for Miami. And then in between, we have Chicago and Philadelphia. Both interesting because their economies depend, Philadelphia very much on eds and meds, Chicago primarily manufacturing, financial insurance, professional and technical services. And so similarly, they didn't take quite the job losses that some of the other cities did, but they also haven't had as robust job gains. Transit ridership in Chicago has recovered only to about 62%. Philadelphia's is much higher at about 79%. And population growth between 2020 and end of 2022 has been flat. And recent demographic data released by the census data done by William Freya of the Brookings Institute does a really nice job looking at how immigration has impacted demographics in the cities, particularly in Miami with lots of immigration. Now, so what should cities be doing? These are, I can't say these are novel recommendations, but these are very much needed recommendations for cities that are dealing with some of the scenarios that may play out in the boom loop, or in the doom loop rather, that to help them prosper in the future. They focus long term. Obviously, the first thing is an economic restructuring of cities that would focus on industries that require in-person work, such as healthcare, life sciences, et cetera, renewable energy manufacturing, these kinds of things. And then transit and housing are two things that I see that go hand in hand. Access, the biggest barrier for a lot of people who work from home are transit costs, both in time and money. If we can improve the transit systems in the metro areas and increase the speed of transit and also lower the cost of those, this would encourage people to go to the office. Certainly office landlords are improving office spaces hand over fist as best they can, but it's still struggling to fill their buildings. Housing production, population growth has been flat or mostly flat across these cities, but there's been a lot of in-migration of younger people, and the housing costs have increased considerably. And so increasing the cost, or rather reducing the cost of housing, increasing the pace of housing production is quite important. And then finally, I'd say quality of life. There are lots of narratives. Each city has a different narrative about what's going on. But certainly the quality of life, the amenities available to people, addressing issues like crime, which we don't necessarily touch on in the paper, but really focus on as a recommendation as to how cities should be moving things forward.
Thank you very much, both David and Dick. And we are pleased to have a panel of extraordinary experts in response to folks, one of whom, Stijn Van Nieuwerburgh, who's going to speak next, a frequent guest, is the Cassius and Shore Professor of Real Estate and Professor of Finance at Columbia University, and a frequent guest. Stijn will speak to the win-win solution of housing conversion of empty office space to housing, brings back activity, brings back tax base. But what are the challenges of making this happen? Stijn?
Sure. Thank you, Susan. And thank you for writing this interesting paper. Very much agree with a lot of the conclusions that your team has arrived at. So, let's talk about solutions, right? Because I think the diagnosis is pretty clear. We have an excess of office. We also have a major housing affordability problem in pretty much all of our cities. And we have another problem, which we haven't touched upon yet, which is the climate transition, right? And so at the end of the day, we need to convert brown offices to green apartments in a nutshell. Now, that's easier said than done. There's physical obstacles to conversion, there's regulatory obstacles to conversion, and there are financial obstacles to conversion. Right, so we've done some work looking at the physical characteristics of office buildings and come to the conclusion that roughly 10% of the office stock is sort of readily convertible based on its physical characteristics. In cities like New York or Chicago, where we have an older office stock, that number is probably closer to 30%. These numbers actually align well with a study that Gensler has done, which also arrives at a number around 20% of the office buildings. So even if the building is physically suitable for conversion, there's a regulatory question. Is residential use permitted? We have, for example, an entire part of Midtown Manhattan, Midtown South, that is full of defunct office buildings, but where residential use is not permitted right now as of right. And that might change in the future, but that would be an important regulatory obstacle. We have height restrictions. Again, some of these things have changed recently or in the process of being changed as part of the April New York State housing budget deal, but are at this point substantial obstacles. But in my mind, the most important obstacle is a financial one, right? The famous office conversion expert, Nate Berman, famously said in a New Yorker article the other day that every building can be converted. It's just a question of cost. And so it's at the end of the day, it's all about the economics of these conversions. And so my modeling exercise has shown that you need essentially three variables to fall into place. First of all, you need to be able to buy the building at a steep discount from its prior, call it pre-COVID valuation, maybe a discount of around 60%. Second, the conversion costs have to be reasonable, and that's going to depend on the physical structure of the building. If you need to build 2 light wells, drill cores in the middle of the building, that's going to massively increase the cost of your conversion. And third, you need to deliver the apartments at the end of the conversion process into a strong apartment market where the rents are strong. And again, that is oftentimes hard to predict because these conversions could take 4 or 5 years. It's hard to have clarity into what that apartment market is going to look like. Now, all of this is said and done. So conclusion from this exercise is basically there's a narrow path towards a market rate conversion. And to be very clear, we're talking about a luxury market conversion here, where we're going to take an office building and produce very high-end apartments, the sort of places that in New York City would rent for $7,000 a month. Now, that's not what we mean by affordable housing by any stretch of the imagination. That is the top 10% of the market. In New York, if you want to deliver an apartment at 80% of area median income, you need to be able to rent that apartment for $2,000 a month instead of $7,000 a month. And so that's not feasible without a subsidy. So we've done the calculations, the NPV on those conversions with let's say, setting aside 25% of apartments at 80% of area median income for 80% of AMI households, completely destroys the economics of these conversions. So you need to subsidize it. And the good news is that the New York State legislator, in its April budget, has passed a subsidy for such conversions, okay? And so the rules are detailed, and I don't want to get into all of the nitty-gritty, but long story short, there's a 90% property tax abatement that's going to last for 35 years. Which is going to help substantially, according to our calculations, to level the playing field between doing a full market rate conversion on the one hand and doing a conversion where you set aside 25% of the apartment units in your project for affordability. It's not a wash. In other words, our conclusion is that the subsidy, as generous as it is not high enough to make the developer indifferent between the market rate conversion and the conversion with affordable units, but it helps to bridge the gap. And maybe for some projects, under some parameters, it might actually work. So, I think the legislator had very good intentions. I think delivering these affordable units is very challenging, though, in high-cost markets. And a 90% subsidy for 35 years, when the subsidy goes away after 35 years, the affordability mandate does not go away. It's permanently affordable. That permanency ends up costing a lot of money and ends up making the economics of these conversions very, very difficult. So I fear that, as well-intentioned as the policy is, that ultimately it will fail to deliver a lot of affordable units in Manhattan. It will hopefully deliver a lot of new housing units. And, we need more housing units. We need, and at some level, I am fine with generating more luxury apartment units, because at the end of the day, that will generate more housing supply through filtering. Eventually, it will free up a unit that is affordable to somebody else, right? So that's sort of my take on the office conversion aspect of the New York State budget. Again, I think it's early days. In New York City, we have about 60 projects signed up for the Office Accelerator, which is a New York City initiative to help eliminate some of the red tape and help some of these projects along and navigate the bureaucratic process. So that is, if all 60 of these get built, that's going to add probably 20,000 apartment units. That would be a really nice down payment on the 500,000 units that Mayor Adams wants to deliver. I am of the belief, I'm a conversion optimist. I'm of the belief that we could deliver 10% of new houses in our urban environment from office conversions. It's not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, but 10% is not nothing either. So that's why I'm optimistic on this.
Well, thanks, Dan. And I know Kathy Wylde wants to address this too. So this is a very, very hot topic. We've had questions about this from Philadelphia, from Detroit, cities all over the country, and probably outside the United States too, are watching this. And it's odd. It's a plus ça change, plus la même chose situation. Many years ago, I lived in a conversion building, a former wharf building on the Boston waterfront that lay derelict after Boston was no longer a port city that it was in the 19th century, and it was in a neighborhood of commercial wharf buildings and warehouses that were all converted to housing and office use quite successfully, and remains to this day a vibrant neighborhood. So it is possible. I've seen it with my own eyes and slept in those walls. So let's cross our fingers. And a little note for everybody: you are tuned into Special Briefing from the Volcker Alliance and Penn IUR. The archived editions of this and all our special briefings are on our websites, and the Special Briefing podcast, of course. And now let's turn to Jose Barrero. He's going to tell us about WFH Research's latest findings, which you can subscribe to online, and maybe also tell us a bit how work from home has affected Mexico City, where you're based.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for having me. So over the past 4 years, a lot of my research time has been focused on trying to measure the amount of working from home in the US economy and more broadly. And so basically I partnered with Nick Bloom at Stanford University and Steve Davis of the Hoover Institution, and we've been running large-scale surveys of primarily US workers, but also some survey efforts around the world to try to measure this. And the concept that we're interested in is the share of paid days that are fully done from home. So in other words, the share of days that there's no commute, which is really the new thing in this post-pandemic age. It's the fact that many more people are staying home the entire day rather than commuting it. Kind of knowledge workers have for a very long time done a little bit of work from home in the mornings, in the evenings, checking email, finishing up stuff. And so that's not really what we're interested in. We're interested in full paid days working from home. And so in a nutshell, what we've seen over the past 4 years, comparing 2019 to now, is about a 4-fold increase in the share of full paid days working from home, from about 7% in 2019, based on our best measures, up to about 27 or 28% right now. This 27 to 28% has actually been quite stable, drifting downward at a very, very slow pace since the pandemic ended somewhere in the first half of 2022. So about 2 years ago, we were at around 31% of paid days being done from home. That, as I said, that's been drifting downwards. Right now, we're at about 27%. Now, that's kind of the broad picture for the US economy, but it's good to look at specific sectors and how kind of this summary metric breaks down in different contexts. So to give you an idea, for full-time employees in the US economy, about 60% of them right now are working fully in person. And that's simply because much of the economy needs to be at the workplace in order to do their job. And so here we're talking about people who work in retail, in manufacturing, in hospitals, who need to provide services on site. So when we look at the population who is doing some working from home, actually the vast majority of them are in a hybrid scheme. And so that's particularly true of knowledge workers, say in big cities like New York City. So these knowledge workers typically come into the office a couple of days a week, stay home the rest of the week. So when you think about fully remote workers, that's really kind of only a sliver of the economy. It's somewhere on the order of 10% of full-time employees. Hybrid is about twice as big. And actually, so I was looking at numbers in our surveys for knowledge workers in New York City. That's about 3 times as big. So kind of almost half of knowledge workers in New York City are in a hybrid scheme, coming in a couple of days a week, staying home the rest of the week, to give you an idea. And kind of if you want to compare different cities across the country, so there is very much a gradient between density and the amount of working from home. So in bigger, denser cities, people tend to do more working from home. And I think that is mostly to do with the sorts of jobs that are in big cities relative to less big cities. So a bigger concentration of knowledge workers and a bigger shift to working from home during 2020 will have generated more persistent working from home in big cities. Now, those differences have flattened over the past couple of years. And I think that's as the world has normalized and people have become more amenable to commute again. We've seen this drop again from about 31% of paid days to 27% of paid days being done fully from home. This hasn't been painless at all. So recently we've asked a series of qualitative questions in our surveys asking people about return to the office, what draws them to the office, and so on. And so amazingly, there's many firms out there that said that they've done several big pushes to return to the office. So some firms as many as 5 pushes to return to the office, which I think gives you a sense of how difficult it is for certain organizations especially in these knowledge work industries to bring their people back. And I mean, I think it's important to think about what is it that draws workers to the office, and so we also ask them about that, and typically the things that come out are they want to collaborate with their colleagues in person, socialize with them, get to know them, but also things like the quality of the office space, which I know kind of feeds in very tightly with some of Stijn's work on how kind of prime office buildings are doing much better than older, less high quality office buildings in New York City. And also ease of coming into the office is kind of a big factor drawing them in.
Well, thanks, Jose. And let's now swing back and in the Q&A period, I do want you to bring up what's going on in Mexico City, because I know you've got some
absolutely
interesting points. So Susan, let's not lose that. But in the meantime, let's swing back across the Hudson River for the unique perspective of Kathryn Wylde at the Partnership for New York City. New York's economy has held up pretty darn well, despite remote work, but we've got housing shortages, transportation issues, public safety concerns. So tell us, Kathy, what lies ahead?
Well, first, let me just say at a micro level, we've been surveying quarterly our major Manhattan office employers. We put out a new survey today in terms of the status of remote work, return to the office. And we are running very steady to where we were in September of 23. This recent report that came out is 56% of workers in office on the average weekday. And that's about pre-pandemic, that's about 72% of where we were pre-pandemic. So it's not as big an impact as some might think, but it's an important change. And as has been said, the quality of new offices in terms of what's been found by employers to get people back to the office, they all say free food. So in addition to moving into fancy new offices and putting a Starbucks on the 20th floor, we've built about 20 million square feet of new office space in the city. The biggest single project in the country, I think Hudson Yards on the west side. So we've created some new office environments, ironically, during the period of the pandemic. And those have gone like hotcakes, and they're charging the highest commercial rents we've ever seen in the city. So in terms of describing our commercial market, as been noted, there's been a flight from old dingy office buildings to brand new buildings, and employers have shown they're willing to pay the price. We also asked in our survey of employers what their where they are in terms of their commitment to New York City, in terms of the real estate commitment. More than half are committed to at least maintaining their current footprint. More than 30% are actually anticipate increasing their footprint in the next year. Only 10% are looking at reducing their footprint. So, and in terms of employees, similar numbers where hiring, expanding their workforce continues to be the attitude. So we are any place but doom. And in the case of our fastest growing industry, the tech sector, they're projecting 70% employment increase. So that's all very positive. I think when we talk, did you want to say something, Bill? Excuse me.
No.
Okay.
Oh, please go ahead.
In terms of where the challenges are, I would agree. As Finn said, we recently, in the last 2 months, have made some major changes in housing policy. We've been affected by beyond the pandemic and beyond remote work. Remote work is just one consequence of the technology revolution in our economy. E-commerce similarly, and telemedicine and remote education all have affected all our institutions, even remote cultural, remote entertainment. And so there have been a lot of dynamics affecting the city. I don't think that remote work is the most significant one in many respects. We may find out that AI ends up having a bigger impact in terms of all that's gone on. So given all that change, New York City and the other big impact we had in 2018, right before the pandemic, was the loss of state and local tax deductibility, which when you look at the states and the urban states that are suffering the most, it is New York, it is California, it's Illinois, and these Connecticut, these are the states that have relatively high state and local taxes, not relatively high state and local taxes. And the loss of deductibility put a big increase on everybody, all the individual taxpayers. And that was, of course, to fund the corporate tax relief, which was good for business, but not for talent. So that's a big part of the challenge that we're dealing with. The cap on state and local tax deductibility expires in 2027, but it's going to be a real fight to retain it, because like in New York, we're sending $14 billion more a year in discretionary income to Washington, and they don't want to lose that. So those are some of the challenges. We're facing those challenges. The housing crisis and the affordability crisis in general is exacerbated by those tax issues. In the case of housing in 2019, we also passed legislation that severely regulated the rental housing stock, and that recently that was even doubled down on with regulation of formerly unregulated stock in the last 2 months. So we've got that challenge of regulation. So new housing is not being produced. We have empty units that are not being rehabilitated. And we have this commercial stock coming online that, again, we have seen after 9/11, in the 80s when Tribeca and Soho went the loft conversions, the artists, the talent wanted to move into old converted loft industrial buildings. So we've been through that and seen it have a major impact, really beyond any expectations, because it became stylish to live in these converted older buildings with whole classes of New Yorkers, the creative class as they're known. So we see all of these as positive possibilities. I think the paper spells out what cities have to do. And I'm pleased that New York City and state are ahead of the game in terms of following most of those recommendations in terms of deregulation, upzoning, taking advantage of density, investment in public transportation. We're about to become the first city in America on June 30th to implement a congestion pricing zone in our central business districts, which will fund improvements in public transportation and hopefully improve quality of life overall. We're about to implement for the first time a containerization program for our garbage, where we'll have no more plastic bags for rats to feed on in the streets and sidewalks. So we've got a lot going on in New York, and we totally agree on the challenge, but we intend to stay both agglomerated and productive.
Well,
Wow.
thanks. Thanks, Kathy. Panelists, if you would unmute yourselves and switch your cameras on so we can get on to Q&A, and Susan, the mic is yours.
Yes, well, thank you for that, Kathy. We intend to continue. We intend to agglomerate. I love that phrase. What's surprising to me about today's conversation so far is the remarkable upbeat. I think the title of the report is Doom Loop or Boom Loop, and we hear only Doom Loop. I don't think we've ever heard Boom Loop, but almost across everyone, we hear positive. So I want to go back to that question. Is there a Doom Loop outlook possible for, let's say, New York, but then more generally, let's talk about San Francisco. And that is, if we don't do it right, if we don't get these policies that appear to be coming in a good way, but there are some limitations. So is a Doom Loop possible? And then we'll talk about how to prevent it. But first that, and let's turn to Dick on that, perhaps, as a start.
Well, thank you, Susan. History is a guide here. We have cities that have gone through more or less permanent doom loops. They've gone from very large cities to very small cities, and that's sort of a doom loop. But even those cities eventually adjust and adapt. I think that there are a lot of levers that cities can pursue, and especially cities that are have real advantages in terms of their human capital, and they can really adapt pretty quickly.
So
New York is the poster child for that, frankly.
Okay, so you're positive on this. So I'm going to turn to Stijn. What about San Francisco? New York, San Francisco, what do you see?
Yeah, I mean,
Chicago?
of course, a doom loop is possible. I think we're in the very early innings, especially on the fiscal side of the implications of this. We are in the middle of the worst office crisis we have seen in the last 40 or 50 years. And the distress is happening every day. Buildings, even in New York City on Broadway, are selling for 40, 50 cents on the dollar relative to their last transactions. You know, there's no doubt in my mind that the worst 100 million square feet of office, the bottom 20, 30% of the office market in New York City, is completely doomed. These buildings need to be either demolished or adaptively reused. And over time, that will have implications for the tax base. Now, that doesn't mean that there couldn't be, you know, a lot of economic growth coming along and clean technology, you know, rising, and New York City taking over some of the role of Silicon Valley potentially. So I'm not saying there are no growth drivers in New York City, and those growth drivers, of course, could help raise taxes in the future. But for sure, we're swimming against the stream here. You know, there's no doubt about it. You know, with all the federal aid expiring, the migrant crisis we have a major fiscal hole in our city. San Francisco is even worse. You know, the office problems are worse there. It has infected the apartment market as well, which hasn't happened in New York City. And there have been major budget deficits in San Francisco. San Francisco lost $500 million in tax revenue early in the pandemic because a lot of their taxes are from businesses because of Proposition 13. They have much less tax revenue from property. And a lot of these employers moved their employees elsewhere, and as a result paid a lot less taxes. So they had to pass emergency tax emergency budgetary reforms mid-year, which they normally never do. So, there's now a candidate running for mayor on the Urban Dumlu platform in San Francisco, right? So clearly this is top of mind. And in my mind, the fiscal cycle is the one that is lagging the most. It's the fundamental cycle. Maybe we're at the bottom of the fundamental cycle in terms of the space market. The financial cycle is behind that, and the distress is now materializing, and the fiscal cycle is the last one because tax assessments are incredibly backward looking. And so it's going to take years for this to play out.
So let me turn to Jose in terms of the work from home could be impacted in a negative way by quality of life and lack of improvement in quality of life. And is this part of it? Can you see that in your data? And that could contribute to a doom loop.
I would agree. I mean, I think a big part of why working from home has stuck is well, first of all, we realized it worked, and it worked when kind of everybody is in one way or another attuned to the fact that it's a possibility. But it really works because workers like it. They like not having to commute. They like staying at home, being relaxed. They like being able to do a load of laundry in the middle of the day instead of playing a game on their computer or just doing small talk with their desk neighbor. And so, yeah, if cities lose their ability to attract people because of quality of life issues, I think that's definitely a contributor, because it in a world where working from home is possible, and that's a big part of my quality of life, then why do I need to be in central San Francisco where there's crime and a lot of quality of life issues if I can move just a few miles away to Marin County or somewhere else where these quality of life issues aren't there? I mean, it's at the end of the day why working from home is stuck is largely because of this. We're just making the day better for a bunch of workers.
Did you have data, for example, on Miami and Texas versus Florida and Texas versus, that's not only in response, obviously, these have always been warmer places. So, and now they're not only, and they're not suffering the work from home. As in our report points out, Miami is doing actually quite well. So do you have data that's specific to these cities?
I do. I mean, I think my sense is that big cities tend to look more like each other than differently. So, I mean, it is the case that, for example, cities in Texas weren't as keen on working from home during the heights of the pandemic as other parts of the country. But I think in general, wherever you have a big concentration of knowledge jobs that can be done from home, there is a propensity to continue doing them.
There just is more migration coming to, which compensates. I do want to turn to the potential for boom, but I don't want to miss the great questions. Bill, maybe you want to go through some of the listener questions.
Well, one of them, we discussed this among ourselves, and we have some audience questions also. What about companies that are, and governments that are trying to force people back into the office 5 days a week? Is this, you certainly see it in some of the banks in New York, but it's a jump ball question. Maybe Kathy should take this first. How successful is this? How successful can this be?
Monumentally unsuccessful. Incentives are helpful, but flexibility is the key to a happy workforce. And so 60% of our employers now have adopted permanently a hybrid schedule, mostly 3 days per week. And others are adjusting depending on the jobs. You saw there was a concern yesterday expressed by some of the banks about regulatory rulings that make certain trader jobs difficult to locate, to do from home for security and other reasons and oversight reasons. So there are exceptions, but overall, employers really don't have a choice. It's the new normal is the expectation of some flexibility in the workplace. I also wanted to just double down on the doom side of things. There definitely still is a big threat. I don't think it is primarily associated with remote work. I think it's a larger question. The fiscal challenges in the last decade, city spending went up more than 50% in New York. And in cities across the country, this is a pattern. And New York is actually in much better shape on things like funded pension funds, which are much better than, say, Chicago, which is a disaster. And so if you look at the overall financial picture of cities, there's kind of an expectation that cities would spend more and do more and solve every problem. The government would solve every problem. And the problem is revenues have kept flowing to cities. And when the revenues are flowing, they all think they can solve every problem by the city government doing more. And that's what's happened to us. We've had a very successful economy that grew out of the 12 years of Mike Bloomberg. And our economy has grown by leaps and bounds, and our tax rolls have benefited. Even this year, our tax rolls came out many billions higher than anybody expected at the state and city level. So all of that looks positive, except for the government is outspending the growth in tax rolls by significant amounts. And that is a potential fiscal crisis. And the other is if the US doesn't fix our broken immigration policy, and we can't continue. And I think this is a problem for San Francisco. And this is where a doom scenario could happen in terms of if we don't have that aggregation of talent, the most productive talent in the world, because we're drawing on international resources, and the caps on H-1Bs and the restrictions on folks coming here, the decrease in the number of students coming from China to study at our universities and go on the graduate students, et cetera. That's the biggest threat right now.
So if I could just follow up on that, the threat of the long-term fiscal decline is clearly there, and part of the response has to be spending to improve the attractors of the city's quality of life, et cetera, and also improving productivity, as you were as you were directly saying, Kathy, which has been the driver of the growth of the cities, has been the talent and productivity. So I do want to return to this underlying work from home just for a second, dynamics, and go back to Jose and others on this of, is there a new normal now where the plus, why people want to come back to the office, according to your survey results, of collaboration is leading to a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, so that we can collaborate? And does this lead to perhaps adjustments that will help the business community that, okay, we just close Monday and we don't have those costs. We have the pluses of, and we minimize the costs. I want to start with you, Jose, then go to Dick on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in a world with hybrid, coordination is key. And we do see some of that in the data, in that by far the most popular working from home day is Friday, as you might expect, so that people can have an extra day of relaxation at home while still being on the clock. What I would say is this collaboration can be a little bit difficult. And so I'll give you a sense of that, in that for hybrid workers, about half of their meetings involve somebody who is connecting remotely into the meeting, whether it's the person who is in hybrid and is on Zoom at the office, or they're in a Zoom room connecting with a different location. So, I mean, we're definitely in a new normal for that. And it's I think that's a more difficult world to live in. And maybe just,
we haven't worked it out yet. Presumably
we haven't fully worked it out yet. And the other thing I would say is when we ask people basically, how do you spend your day on a day when you stay home versus on a day when you come into the office, they spend a lot of time doing individual work on in-office days, almost as much as on working from home days, which kind of suggests that this time allocation problem is, ideally you would reserve all your individual work for your working from home days, but it seems to be not so easy to do that in practice, basically.
There is a coordination problem. Dick, your thoughts?
I just wanted to interject something, because it's to follow on Susan's question, and Kathy and everybody else may have an opinion on this. New York's very lucky in a way. It's geographically huge. It's 5 counties as well as a city. A lot of work from home workers are still living in New York and have transferred their restaurant business or their dry cleaning or whatever from the central business district to Flushing or Riverdale, or you pick Flatbush, pick your neighborhood. So net New York hasn't done so bad in sales taxes and retail sales. But what does this all mean for the traditional central business districts when you have a permanent less than 100% in office population? Retail sales, restaurants, the whole thing, all the people who serve the commuting public.
If I could jump in, this is not directly in response, Bill, but just the work from home question, the hybrid question. My firm, my huge firm of 35 people, we were at 3 days a week. We're now at 4, and we've been doing pretty well with that. But there's one difference, and that is that we're almost totally flexible. When people have they need to do things, we say, sure, I want to be away for 2 weeks, and two-thirds of that is vacation. We're flexible. We could have never done it in the past. What drove us to go to 4 days was the fact that we perceive the need to be able to walk into someone's office and talk to them and learn from them. And so, no one's in here on Fridays, but on Monday through Thursday, most everybody is here. But it's a completely different environment than it used to be in terms of flexibility. And that's absolutely here to stay. In Philadelphia, our city just went to 5 days, is going to 5 days a week. And frankly, the biggest competitor for our talent has been the city. So we're delighted because there's no longer sort of the biggest competitor in the city for our talent. And we've lost half dozen people in the last 3 years to the city.
So there are pluses and minuses. Dick, if I may, I do want to go to key questions. One from one of our long-term guests, Eric Kim of Fitch Ratings, raises the puzzle. In a city like New York, with office occupancy down so severely, yet residential and rents and sale prices are near record highs. Why? Who would like to opine on this?
Well, very quickly, household size, family size has gone down because kids who were working remotely weren't going to live 5 to an apartment. So that took up a lot of space and raised values. And our production program halted 2 years ago for all practical purposes. The main state incentive for rental housing production was halted. So our production went from close to 40,000 new units a year to under 11,000. So production cut off, and then the much more constraining rent regulations made it difficult to finance new housing.
This helps explain New York City. Stijn, do you want to comment on cities across the U.S.? I think it's true that rents and housing prices are up despite office rents down dramatically, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kathy put her finger on the most important drivers. I think, remote work as an aggregate phenomenon has increased the demand for space everywhere. Now, this has benefited suburban areas relative to urban areas. So actually, as much as rents are up in places like New York and some other major cities, they're actually up more in the suburbs of those places. So that trend has not reversed.
So does this increase in rents and housing prices, that sounds like a positive for the long run fiscal outlook that helps weigh against this negative coming from the office apocalypse?
Not really, no, because it makes it impossible to recruit young talent. I mean, New York firms were already paying a 20% salary premium to other competitive places because of the cost of living, mostly the cost of housing. So no, more than half our population is rent burdened under existing terms. The average rent for an apartment, asking rent for an apartment across the whole city, including the Bronx, is just under $4,000 a month. So who can afford this?
So the affordability issue stops the creative class from being part of the new renaissance. Dick, I see you have some thoughts.
You really do need to look at the supply side of housing, as both Kathryn and Stijn have said. And it doesn't matter whether you're building market rate units or affordable units. You put more units on the market, filtering has to happen. People have to come from somewhere. So I think that the housing supply is crucial. But I want to say that not all cities are like New York. If you're in Philadelphia, my home, the employment market has always been weak. It's been weak for 50 years. But the suburban employment market's been pretty good. But there's been a lot of demand for living in the city in relatively affordable housing. And many of those people that were living in the city were commuting to the suburbs. And in Philadelphia, there are whole neighborhoods that have tons of people who work in the suburbs, now remotely, and their neighborhood's more attractive than ever for them. So, because they're not going out to, however far they're going for their suburban job. And I don't know how many cities are in that particular state, but, even in Philadelphia's central business district, there's a ton of people who live there everywhere. And conversion's been going on for 30 years in Philadelphia. But in the neighborhoods of Philadelphia, that's where people were having modest priced housing, and they were commuting to the suburbs by car. And now they're commuting way less to the suburbs with the same job. That's a good thing for the city.
So Dick, I have a wrap-up question, but maybe you want to get another question in from the audience before, or do we need to go to
Well,
wrap up?
I want to get to Jose's point that we were talking about before we went live, which is one of the sort of one of the surprising consequences of work from home and how it's affected Mexico City.
Yeah, so absolutely. And it's interesting because in the neighborhood that I live in, which is one of the more residential, walkable neighborhoods with tons of cafes and so on, it's basically full of digital nomads who are, I'd say, a very small fraction of the workforce, but for a place like the neighborhood where I live, they've completely warped the nature of the city because residential prices are up, especially if you want to buy more so purchase than rental prices are really high. But they've improved the quality of life of residents who can still afford to live there, like myself, whereas other people have had to move away because the area basically has gentrified and prices are up.
But these are digital nomads from Mexico or from the U.S.
I would say they're from many places around the world, from mostly the developed world and there the U.S. in particular. And I mean, I think part of the issue is that in my neighborhood, there's just so many apartment buildings where 50% of the building is basically Airbnbs that are there catering to this population and to transient visitors as well.
So cities are going to have to compete more than ever. Can they and will they? What's the optimistic outlook? What needs to be done to perhaps bring us to a boom loop? And is it possible? And perhaps, David, let's start with you.
Sure. I would, just to reiterate some of the things that we said, I really think, making the transition from wherever somebody's living to where they're working or where people want them to work is key. Making the commuting fluid, making it easy, making it cheap. That is not a small ask. That's significant investments in ways that the United States typically hasn't done in its past.
So housing supply.
And
we've got to wrap it up. Yeah. So any other last comment, David? And then let's just go.
No, that's it.
Okay, great. Wrapping it up, Kathy. How do we get to boom loop for New York City, or at least stable growth?
Well, again, I think what the improvements in transportation, public safety, our Mayor Adams says public safety is the precondition to prosperity. And I think that's an area where we have work to do. and we're concerned about, so, and the affordability question, and that's looking into the sources, the part the politicians don't like are the details, and looking into the sources of high construction costs, high insurance costs, what is making our city unaffordable, and high taxes. Those are all issues that we have some control over. The federal government often has more control over.
Thank you. Jose?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say one key thing is making sure that knowledge workers have a reason and that they want to come into the city and into the office
Great.
to
We have, like,
collaborate, to do stuff in person.
30 seconds, Stijn.
Yeah, create and spur innovation. Look at the jobs that need in-person interaction. Create a business-friendly environment and a safe environment.
Thank you. Bill, wrap up time.
Thanks, Susan. And it is time. Noah, would you put up the information slide? So that's it for this edition of Special Briefing. Up on your screen, you'll see contact information for all of our panelists and communications staff. So if you want to follow up, there it is. And thank you to our terrific panelists. Thank you to our co-host, Susan Wachter, and to the Volcker Alliance, members of the Penn IUR Board of Advisors and the Century Foundation. And of course, to our production team, Graham Dowd, Noah Ritzenberg, Idalis Foster, Arden Jordan, and Megan Schmigdal. And special thanks to you, our audience, for joining Special Briefing today. We'll be back on June 27th with a deep dive into the $1 trillion that states hand out every year in tax breaks to individuals and companies. So watch our websites and your email for details. And remember to catch up on this and all of our other special briefings on our podcast. And so for now, I'm Bill Glasgow with Susan Wachter, and we'll see you in June.